All right, let's dive into what might just be the single most important step for any new venture. We're pulling this straight from MIT's playbook for entrepreneurs, and it's all about testing your key assumptions. This is where you find out if your brilliant idea is also a brilliant business.
So let me start with a question for you. What do you think is the #1 startup killer? It's not running out of cash. It's not getting crushed by a competitor. No, the real reason is actually much simpler, and it's a trap that gets sprung on thousands of founders every single year.
And there it is. They build something that nobody actually wants. All that work, all that passion, all that money, spent creating a perfect solution to a problem nobody has. Or maybe a problem they're not willing to pay to fix. It sounds brutal, I know, but facing this reality head-on is the very first step to making sure it doesn't happen to you.
So how do the smart founders sidestep this disaster? Simple. They treat their big idea not as a fact, but as a collection of guesses. And some of those guesses are pretty risky. So what's the antidote to risky guesses? Data. And that's exactly where testing your assumptions comes into play. It's how you turn those guesses into facts.
This really gets to the core of it all. You've gone out, you've done the market research, you've talked to potential customers. That's fantastic. But it's only half the story. The real magic, the real insight, happens when you mix what people say they'll do with hard data on what they actually do. That's the combination that puts you on the path to success.
Okay, so what are we really testing here? We're on the hunt for our key assumptions. Just think of these as the pillars that your entire business plan is resting on. If even one of them is wrong, well, it's like building a skyscraper on a foundation of sand.
And let's be crystal clear here. A key assumption isn't some small detail. It's a belief that is so fundamental that if it proves to be false, the whole business idea just completely falls apart. You know, things like, customers will happily pay $50 a month for this, or we can get a new customer for less than $10. If you're wrong about those, you don't have a business.
And it's really important to see that this isn't some extra thing you do. It's the critical next step that proves all your earlier research was on the right track. I like to think of it this way. Your research gave you a map of the territory. Testing your assumptions is like sending out a few scouts to make sure that map is actually accurate before you march your whole army in.
Now, the process itself is actually pretty straightforward. First, you just brainstorm. Get every single belief you have about your customers, your market, your product, all of it, down on paper. Then you prioritize. Ask yourself, which of these, if I'm wrong, would sink the entire ship? And finally, and this is so important, you break those giant assumptions down into tiny specific things that you can actually go out and test.
Okay, so once you have those little testable pieces, it's time to switch hats. You need to stop being your idea's biggest cheerleader and start acting like a scientist who is just looking for the cold, hard truth. And a scientific approach really just means you test one thing at a time. I mean, think about it. If you test 3 different assumptions with one big experiment and it fails, how do you know which assumption was wrong? You don't. The data is useless. So you've got to be disciplined. One specific experiment for each tiny little hypothesis.
And hey, you do not need a fancy lab for this. The absolute best experiments are cheap, they're fast, and they're simple. Remember, the goal here is not to build your final product. The goal is to get real-world evidence, actual data, as quickly as you possibly can, and that usually means without writing a single line of code.
So you might be wondering, how do you actually do this? How can you possibly test demand for a product that doesn't even exist yet? Well, let's look at a few super effective ways to do this that are more about being clever than about being a coder.
You have got to understand this hierarchy of evidence. It'll save you so much time. Look, someone saying, hey, that's a cool idea, is nice, but as data, it's super weak. There's no skin in the game. Even a letter of intent is really just a promise. But when someone pulls out their wallet and prepays for your solution, that is the loudest, clearest signal of demand you could ever hope for. You've got to test their wallet, not just their words.
And this isn't just about what customers want. What about your own cost assumptions? There's a brilliant way to test those too. Just send out a simple request for quotation, an RFQ, to a few potential suppliers. Ask them, hey, if I were to order 10,000 of these, what would my price be? Just like that, you'll find out if your financial projections are based in reality or if they're just total fantasy.
And here's how it all comes together. Look at that first example. For maybe $200 in ads, you can A/B test the simple landing page. That one cheap experiment can tell you if people are interested, what marketing message works, and if they'll actually sign up. Or look at that last one, running a simulation with a simple MVP, a minimum viable product. It's an amazing way to test out a service without having to build all the complicated tech behind it.
This is exactly what lean experimentation is all about.
So let's wrap this up and talk about the real payoff here. Why go through all this trouble? Well, because this whole process is what separates the startups that make it from the ones that just become cautionary tales.
This is what it's all been leading to: convergence. It's that beautiful moment when what people said in your research finally lines up with what they did in your experiments. When those two things meet, you've found something real. You've officially de-risked your idea. And now you have earned the right to go and build a product because you know people will actually buy it.
Ultimately, what we're talking about is a huge shift in mindset. The old way was just a leap of faith, right? Build it and they will come. That's a great line for a movie, but it is a terrible business strategy. The smart way is a calculated scientific approach. Test the assumptions first, then build.
So, I'm going to leave you with this question. And it doesn't matter if your idea is on a napkin or if you already have a growing company. Think about it right now. What is the single riskiest, most foundational belief that your entire venture is built on? And more importantly, what's a cheap, fast experiment that you could run today to find out if it's true?